Sure.
It's my pleasure to bring in someone who is maybe a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but not totally, or not really. This is Matthew Richter, and he is a champion of the arts in Seattle for 30 plus years. And he's the founder of the Multidiscipline Arts Center, Consolidated Works, which I'd like to touch upon a little bit. And of course, his work with cultural spaces in government and now outside of government. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks for the invitation. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Looking back at your time with Consolidated Works and now with cultural spaces, what comparisons can you make from that?
Yeah, that's a that's a great and interesting question. Meaning, it's one that I have not explicitly thought about. Right, like what's the thread? Not just the thread from one to the other, but what are the echoes from one to the other? So, Consolidated Works, for those who don't know, was a multidisciplinary contemporary art center that I founded and a group of us ran in the 90s and aughts in South Lake Union, prior to the rebuilding of South Lake Union. It was about 25,000 square feet, and it had a 150-seat live theater and a 50-seat movie theater and a 6,000-foot art gallery and a bar and artist studios and a music space, lecture hall, resource center, offices for other nonprofits. Like, it was we always described it as sort of a one-stop shop. And in that sense, it was sort of a microcosm, right, of the art scene, of the cultural scene in Seattle, or at least it was trying to be. It really said that well, again, we were trying to say that the arts aren't these different languages in Seattle. It's not that I think a lot of people think, and it's tempting to believe, oh, I speak visual art, but I'm not a theater person, or I'm a theater person, but film is not really, I don't understand film. I don't speak film. I don't speak music. I speak, literary arts. And the point we were trying to make, the scene we were trying to create, was the idea that these different arts disciplines are not different languages, but that they're different dialects within one language of sort of arts and culture. And that all that it takes to pick up on a dialect is exposure to it. You don't need to learn to speak a completely different language. You just need the exposure. And so the sort of path of least resistance, if you're showing up for a show in the theater, you may as well stop in the gallery. If you're there for a day in the gallery, you may as well stay for a film or a music night. That path of least resistance created an audience that really thought of themselves as sort of a pan-arts audience, a more broadly cultural audience. So sort of tracing that through to the Cultural Space Agency and the cultural space work that I was doing at the City of Seattle, again, this belief in the idea that we are one cohesive cultural community, but that we are not a melting pot, right? It's not one big, Conworks wasn't one giant space where just weird multidisciplinary projects happened. I mean, it could be, there were spaces for that, but each discipline had its independent sort of honored space. And in that way, I think of our cultural community here in Seattle as a group of connected and loving but independent communities and cultures that need mutual support, that need to be housed. It comes down ultimately to the walls around it. That's what's taken me from all these projects, to the extent that what I've done has been a career and not just like bouncing from one weird job to another, is the idea that they're all connected by a focus on the walls that hold them. When we say cultural space, we can get really interesting in how we define cultural space. One of my favorite definitions comes from an artist who I adore, who said, I'm a cultural person, so cultural space is wherever I am. Cultural space is mobile in that sense. And I love that. Mm-hmm. But for me and for the work that I've done, cultural space has really been about the four walls, about this very literal interpretation of the phrase, about the square feet themselves. And so how do those square feet function to hold culture, to honor culture, to provide an opportunity for culture to thrive and for community to thrive, but not to force it into anything through its presence within those walls, right? The walls aren't there to shape it. The walls are there to hold it the way that it exists.
Instead of my asking a question right now, what do you want to say about the Cultural Space Agency that people should know?
That it is purely community driven. We have tried to create this structure that is as responsive to community need and as resistant to sort of a top down directed model as we could. And so it is a very porous organization. Just getting started. We're a year out of the gate, but we've already raised over $17 million. We've acquired over 50,000 square feet of cultural real estate in partnership with a dozen different Black and brown community-based arts and cultural organizations. It is directed by a constituency that's a volunteer group of about 50 people from cultural communities, from real estate communities, all from communities of color. That group then nominates our governing council, which is a group of 18 people, also from a lot of those similar communities that govern and run the organization like a board of directors. We are currently in search of a next round of staff to run this organization. I am explicitly an interim director. I'm here to help it stand up and to help launch the organization. And yeah, there's a ton of opportunity to get involved. There's a ton of opportunity to be a part of what drives this thing and defines the thing in the future.
Now, my other question is not pointed, but not necessarily my own. And this is cities can choose to expand or to control their growth. Did Seattle make the right choice to aggressively move forward in growth?
Yeah, no one at the planning office is ever going to watch this, right? Has Seattle ever made the right choice about its planning and growth? I was looking at a chart of the growth rate of Seattle, and in 1906, which happens to be what I was looking at because that's when King Street Station was built, the rail station in Pioneer Square.
Yeah.
Which I was part of the group that helped move the Seattle's arts office to the top floor of that and create a new cultural space up there. And with the Cultural Space Agency, we're building a youth-centered art space on the second floor of that station this coming year. So I'm curious about that period when it was built, when most of Seattle was built in around 1900 and 1910. And you get this spike in our growth rate where we've never grown as fast. It's right when Seattle incorporated or sort of annexed or brought in Columbia City and Ballard and and West Seattle, all these areas that had been independent cities and were now going to be part of Seattle proper. And we built an electrical system. We built a water system. We really created Seattle the way that we know it in that period. Replaced the Seattle that existed, I should say. The only other time when we've hit that similar growth rate is the period of the late teens to the early 20s, like now, really 100 years later. Our growth rate, which had been growing since the 80s, hockey sticked. And in 2018, I think it was our fastest growth. A person moved to Seattle every 9 minutes. Around the clock. That's net growth. We expanded by a person every 9 minutes. At the same time, we built a housing unit. We completed a housing unit in Seattle in 2018 about every 135 minutes. So you look at those two numbers, and to me, those are the two numbers that define this city's growth recently anyway. There's no way for that to have resulted in anything but the 10,000 people a night who sleep on the street, who live unhoused in this town. And with that goes a sort of commensurate lack of commercial space and cultural space and anything, again, that has to happen within four walls, within the square feet. So our inability to keep up with our own growth regardless of how we do it. Like there's all these different strategies of urban villages. We should grow in our dozen or so urban villages, which are, the little neighborhood commercial clusters, and everything else should be single family housing. Or it should all be missing middle. We should just be a 4-story tall town, period. Regardless of what the strategy is, the fact that like we're just not doing it, we're not growing, we're stuck between this desire to not sprawl out into undeveloped or less developed suburban and rural areas around ourselves, and the desire not to really embrace the density that we need, kind of screws this town, kind of puts us in a bind that I don't know how we're getting out of.
Now, this is a question that I don't want to ask, but I just for the sake of people that are curious, or how to phrase this, do you think that Seattle's good heart, its leniency towards various things, I don't know, we have to go into too much, but I don't want to go into a detour, but a leniency on homelessness, people can pitch a tent and we're pretty much going to be left alone. And there have been laws in the books recently where certain crimes there's not a real consequence. I mean, you could steal up to $1,000 and you won't really face major consequence. Do you think, and people talk about this, I've heard it on the bus. I've heard homeless people discuss where they're going to live next, but these are, I don't know if you agree or not, but there's a hardcore element of homeless folks that's their lifestyle, and they navigate to LA for the weather, then they move over to Seattle, and they know what they're doing, and they talk amongst themselves, and they figured out that Seattle is an easy place to be homeless. That's that element. What do you say to that?
I should say, A of all, I am as much an expert in issues around homelessness as the next person sitting next to me on the bus, which is to say I'm not an expert in any of these issues, and I don't truly understand our systems. But I think that when we say Seattle's an easy place to be homeless, or an easy place to experience homelessness, I can't imagine that there is an easy, I cannot imagine that it feels easy to live in sub-freezing temperatures on the street in an old tent. I think it's an easy place to be homeless because it's one of the least affordable cities in the country. It's an easy place to slip from. I mean, when I moved here in 1990, you could be poor. You could have a shitty job and be poor and still afford an apartment in the heart of Capitol Hill, and could still afford to go out and buy a round on Friday nights for your friends.
Yeah.
And this is now a town that is only for folks who have had some financial success. And it is no longer a town for anyone but those who can afford it, right? The average cost of a 1-bedroom in this town, I think, is $1,800 now. 2 bedrooms is $2,500. My first apartment in Seattle is $300.
Yeah.
My dad could say the same, that his first apartment in wherever was 30 cents a month. But the raw numbers are but still it's a very easy town in which to slip into homelessness unintentionally. Is it an easy town in which to be homeless? No, I think that this town does a really bad job at keeping people housed. Clearly it does. When we move people out from living in a park or on a baseball field or on the sidewalk or under a bridge somewhere, there's this, I think, myth that we move them into stable and supportive services that just don't exist. We move them into a temporary bed for a night or two, and then they're right back outside again. In cities where there's more permanently supportive housing, we see folks transitioning out of homelessness more than we see it here, where we don't have that. The what's the physics, the law of the preservation of matter, right? Just because someone's no longer sleeping in the park doesn't mean that they are magically not sleeping outside anymore.
Hmm.
Until you solve the problem, I think a lot of people in this town are anti-homelessness, but not pro-homeless people.
Oh,
Right?
sure.
They're anti-homelessness and anti-homeless people, and you can't be both. I remember reading there was some marker within the last decade or so where Seattle or King County, I think it was, had spent a decade fighting homelessness through some frame. The state of emergency was a decade old, or the state of something was a decade old. And at the same time, it was noted that we had spent $1 billion with a B dollars on the homelessness issue. And I thought if we had taken that $1 billion a decade ago and built 10,000 really cheap housing units, we'd be done. We wouldn't have an issue. Everyone would be housed. And honestly, it was that recognition around homelessness and thinking about the work we were doing at City of Seattle around cultural space that led to the creation of the Cultural Space Agency. We had spent a decade at City of Seattle trying to fund nonprofits to stabilize spaces and to create cultural space. We'd spent a decade trying to incentivize the private sector and the development world to embrace cultural spaces and cultural life as part of their projects. We'd spent a decade trying to remove barriers and lower hurdles to the creation of cultural space and preservation of cultural space. And finally came around to the same recognition in looking at the world of supporting homeless folks living unhoused around cultural space. If we just go out and build it, if we were just to take those resources and instead focusing on incentivizing and funding and removing barriers, and instead go out and actually build the thing that we want to see, that would be a more efficient way to do it. And so that's what led to the creation of this new independent agency called the Cultural Space Agency, that a group of 20 people and really a group of hundreds of people advocated for and founded. And I'm the interim director of that, whose mission is to go out and create ownership of cultural space, create literal community wealth through the ownership of real estate that houses cultural activity and cultural organizations and cultural creatives. And so that's sort of how that was the connection, I think, to the homelessness question in the cultural space question.
Well, I will move on to a question about cultural space, but just for the sake of clarity, I think the question was kind of took a little bit of a detour. I think when the ease of being homeless in Seattle, I think that the thinking was, well, it's weather-wise, the weather's relatively pleasant as opposed to, say, New York. You can find a way to be in Seattle, maybe not the whole year, but part of the year. And there's also the, I don't know what term would work, but there's people who exploit the system. There's the criminal element. There's all manner of crime coming from the tents, not the innocents, but the people who are the exploiters. I lived in Ballard for many years, and I can tell you that in sidewalks that I've walked, there was one person who was bludgeoned. This was at the grocery store. They've set fire to the encampment. This is in Ballard Commons. The encampment would go away, to be cleared away after lots of protests from the neighbors. The developers developed Ballard Commons. They called it Ballard Commons. The park was the showpiece. That was completely taken over by the homeless. Lots of them were part of, they weren't all innocent folks. All these were hardcore folks. Their criminal elements is what the neighbors who see it day to day call it. And so it's not, there's lots of gray area, let's say. It's not black and white. You can't say it's just one thing, right?
Yeah, I hesitate to criminalize a whole class of folks based on what are, and I don't know the numbers. Are folks living unhoused more likely to commit violent crime than folks living housed? It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. I haven't done my homework there. But my suspicion is that, I know that wage theft is the highest, is the largest niche of crime in Washington State, which clearly is a very white collar corporate crime. But that there's more of it than there is of, violent crime in encampments. So I don't, as someone who lives in Seattle and has for a long time and lives in the Central District and sees folks living unhoused all the time, I don't, I can't say that there is not violent crime associated with folks living in those conditions, but I don't know that it's any more prevalent there than anywhere else. Maybe it's just more visible because folks are on the street and not doing it, behind closed doors. I don't know.
Well, I won't keep you on the hot seat much longer on that. Let me move on. Can you describe for us what it takes to flourish as a cultural space?
Yeah. Well, can I? I think it takes not focusing on the cultural space the whole time. I think what it takes to flourish as a cultural space is being able to focus on showing visual art, teaching kids music, celebrating tap dance, doing capoeira, whatever the programming of the organization is. If you're able to really focus on that and not constantly be worrying about your space issues, is my lease going to be renewed? Is this getting too expensive? What are the other issues around controlling space? That's the key, right? Is for it not to be about your space, for it to be about what you're doing, your cultural programming. Which again, not to constantly tie everything back to the Cultural Space Agency, but it's what I'm doing. There's a mechanism that was designed to do nothing but worry about cultural space issues, to do nothing but worrying about affordability and acquisitions and capital stacks and waterfalls and all the things around cultural space real estate management. The Cultural Space Agency was called the Cultural Space Agency for two reasons. One, I'm a NASA nerd, and so I love the idea of a space agency. Two, the thing that I heard from community over and over and over again for the decade that I was, sort of the point of contact for the city into these issues, was about agency, was about control, was about this sense of control of your future. And an organization that had a good, solid sense of the control of its own future. Jack Straw Productions is a great example of a group that owns its own cultural space and has been managing it. And like that part of their organization is locked and fairly solid. And they can thrive as an organization programmatically because they have agency, they have control, they have a sense of control, they know what's going on. An organization that doesn't has a really hard time thriving because they're constantly, it's like the what is the hierarchy of needs thing, right? You gotta have your baseline stuff figured out before you can start worrying about the higher level stuff. An organization that doesn't have its baseline, like where we are in space and how long are we going to be here and will we be able to sustain it? If you don't have that stuff covered, there's no way to really excel at teaching kids how to play the flute or whatever it is that the programming is.
I'm glad that you mentioned Jack Straw. There's so many gems in Seattle over the years that I just cherish. Some that are no longer around, like the Little Theater. I'm sure you remember the Little Theater. And and then there's one that's very much alive, Short Run. Yeah. Which is doing
that speaking of Little Theater, that was my first space in Seattle back in the early 90s.
Oh.
I opened it had been a theatrical lighting supply shop. And when that went out of business, I took it as a small gallery and theater called Room 608. And then it became a woodworking shop, and then it became the Little Theater, and then it became WET, Washington Ensemble Theater.
And there's something I'm kind of jumping ahead, but maybe better to ask now than wait. Greg Lundgren, I bring him up because he had this show that was tech workers presenting their art, and it received such a bad reception from people who thought that they were being left out.
Uh-huh.
And I just think that's unfortunate, because how much demonizing can you do about Amazon and Google and whatnot?
Yeah.
Anyone can be an artist. And if you happen to have a nice job and you've paid your dues and you're doing a good work and you also love doing art, why can't you do art?
Yeah. No, I agree. And I clearly, I think Greg agrees. And I think Greg also agrees that just the messaging around that show and how it was pitched was maybe a little casual, and that there was pushback. But I also think he's retooling that show. He's not dropping it. I think he's thinking about remounting it with a different frame. And I think, I shouldn't say that on an actual podcast, but my understanding from what I read last was that he was thinking about how to incorporate some of the criticism and move forward with the show.
Oh, great. Well, that would make sense. Now, I remember in a similar podcast to this, you were talking very eloquently about how humans have become more of an urban animal. But what can you say about the fact that there's still going to be so many people who prefer a rural environment, smaller cities, and there is great interest in smaller cities?
Yeah, from my son, especially. I grew up outside of sort of on the fringes of a couple of different urban environments and was always fascinated by them and wanted to get into the heart of the city. And my 10-year-old, who was growing up arguably sort of in the heart of the city, is like, no, get me out of here. I want to go to the rural places. I think also that one of the things that attracted me to Seattle in the 90s, and that attracted decades worth of people to urban cores, was affordability, was the fact that for 25 or 30 years, no one moved to Seattle for 25 years, from the late 50s to the early 80s, really. Seattle had a negative growth rate that culminated in this billboard that became famous. A couple of real estate agents took out a billboard on I-5 that said, "With the last person to leave Seattle, please turn off the lights." That created a pocket of affordability in the urban center where these spaces were available both to live in. So, economically disadvantaged cultural communities could thrive in urban centers, and to launch new businesses in. And so Black Arts West and Annex Theater and and 911 Media Arts and Jack Straw all took these giant spaces and started programming them, because they were like pennies on the dollar, cheap warehouse spaces. Then when the interest in the center city returned in the 90s and into the aughts, and big corporate campuses were relocating into the city, Amazon, etc., from the suburbs. We had the sort of Microsoft model of the outlier campus.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, the affordability issues went crazy, and it became much harder to buy a house in Seattle than outside of Seattle, which was a flip for the first time in decades, right? The suburbs had always been more expensive than the center city, and now all of a sudden the center city is more expensive than the suburbs. And so we're pushing cultural communities, which tend to align with economically disadvantaged communities, out of Seattle, or out to the peripheries anyway, to the north and the south, to where the affordability is now. And you've got this inversion of affordability. And I'm coming around to your answer about, coming around to your question, I think, about we're globally now an urban species, but what happens now to the ex-urban spaces? And I think you're seeing that with that inversion of affordability, you're seeing the strip malls and the corporate parks and the campuses outside of Seattle lower in price, that the affordability really is returning to the periphery, to the outside of Seattle. And in the same way that growing up in the suburbs, I was fascinated by the center city because that's where culture seemed to be thriving. That's where the organizations and the communities were really taking space and making it their own, and coming together. Drew me to the center of the city like a freaking magnet. Is the same happening? So my 10-year-old, is he going to be drawn to the suburbs growing up in the city? Is he going to be taking transit out of the city to go find the really interesting theater and dance and art and music that I traveled into the city to find 40 years ago? So I'm curious to see what the future is. I think we're in a weird limbo point right now of that inversion of that flex that of affordability. And I'm curious to see, will the strip malls of suburbia be the warehouses of Pike Pine to the next generation of like finding fallow, affordable space to turn into art space? It would be cool.
Yeah. Now, is that going to be a concern for the Cultural Space Agency? I would think they would still want to be somewhere within this Seattle proper.
We want to be wherever the community is that needs us.
Yeah.
If that's Seattle proper, cool. It's definitely no longer Pike Pine.
No.
That's where our community was, 30 years ago. It's not there anymore. Something different is there now. It's not the Central District anymore, with beautiful exceptions, Wanawari and Art Noir and Pratt and Photo Center Northwest. But with a few exceptions, our community is not here in the neighborhood anymore. And so the space agency will go where community is and where we're needed, and where the opportunity is, where the affordability is.
Now, this is a more simple, but maybe interesting enough question to break into. What do you think are the roadblocks that are holding back artists?
They're financial.
Yeah.
They're the ability to the ability to afford the space in which to work and the time in which to work. Being a sort of cultural creative, being an artist has, in my experience, always been something that, at least at the beginning of your career, you're doing around the thing that you need to do to make money. It's not the day job. But I think that's gotten so much more extreme in the past decade, at least here in Seattle, that so much of it is about, creating the space and creating the time to do the work. And that's about money. And clearly, like the elephant in the room, as we're sitting here on Zoom, we haven't been allowed to come into these freaking rooms together to celebrate this together for 2.5 years. And I was at this opening of Art Noir, this new art space in the Central District, the other night, and talking to some folks about what's been happening for the last 2.5 years, and just how huggy that scene was, just because like it kind of felt like we're back to a small degree. And we were wondering, someone I was talking to, one of the people that runs the gallery there, was talking about the arts as a religious experience, as a religious cohesion, religious community, the art community. And that I was saying that historically, I think about times when different religious communities were persecuted, not allowed to sort of celebrate in public, not allowed to go get together at the church or the synagogue or the space, or to be public about it. And then historically, the stories that I've always heard is that it becomes this very intimate, personal celebration of religion, right? You get the tiny congregations getting together by candlelight in someone's back room or in someone's basement. And maybe I'm just too old to have been a part of it, but I didn't see that happening in the last 2.5 years in the cultural community. I didn't see the arts community really coming together anyway. I know that there were party places where the youngins would party in the last 2 years when we go to the clubs. But in terms of like performance and dance and music and visual art, I don't know that that happened. Um, so um, yeah, in terms of the community coming together, like what's been a barrier? Um, the ability to come together, the ability to actually be in rooms together and celebrate and respond to some art on the wall. Let it push us into making our own work that responds to it. I think that's a giant piece of being an artist in this town, is responding to the other artists in this town. And if you can't be in rooms together, how are you going to respond to them?
Yeah, that brings up so many thoughts. I think that a lot of creativity, unexpected things have happened because of Zoom, people meeting that would not normally meet, the frequency of meeting over Zoom, sharing things in interesting, unusual ways that just you would not have thought all the different type of interactions you could have had
Have
prior
you
to this.
have you had experiences over Zoom in the last couple of years that felt like it triggered that same response in you of being at a show, of being in a room with folks?
Well, I think it's possible. I think right now, just us talking directly one-on-one, it's a very special type of communication we're doing, because we wouldn't necessarily be able to do this in person. Something might get in the way, a distraction. But right now, it's just you and me talking one-on-one. A lot of people have started these little shows that have become part of what they do. There's a lot of, I think of Noah Van Sciver, for instance. I interviewed him recently, and he started to interview fellow cartoonists over Zoom. And I don't believe he would have done that before Zoom became a phenomenon.
Yeah. And we've been doing programs where we're able to bring in folks from around the country and around the freaking planet.
Yeah.
Into conversations that you'd never fly someone here from Nairobi to be a part of a conversation. But in Zoom times, I'm sorry, you got to stay up till 10 p.m. But yeah, thanks for joining us. And that's been beautiful. I'm just wondering if the same, like that visceral feeling of being in a room together and celebrating
sure.
cool. Like, have you had that? Have you? I don't had a couple of, there were a couple of music interludes in meetings that felt like that for me. But it's been so few and far between on Zoom for me anyway.
Well, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, because the dynamics are very different when you're, I guess if you were, one that comes to mind is I was seated in an intimate cafe setting, a bench table, face to face with the person I'm interviewing. So that kind of felt like that forced face-to-face format for Zoom, but in person. And in person, it is a totally different dynamic, of course. And you're gauging what people are people listening in? What's that person over there doing? Maybe a sound from the background that will make its way into the conversation, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it is a very, very different animal.
Yeah.
But let me move on before we run out of time. We don't want that to happen on us. Now, young people are flocking to Seattle. I think the way they used to flock to New York. Of course, but people still make a beeline to New York. But I've talked to some young people as of late, and it turns out I'm going to Seattle eventually. So, what would you tell a young person contemplating moving to Seattle?
It's more expensive than you think. It is also a big enough town now. We used to say about New York City that no matter what you're looking for, you can find it in New York City, anything. And you can probably find it 24 hours a day. I don't think that's true here in town, but I think more and more in the larger we get, the more true it is that it's possible to find what you're looking for. There are a lot of Seattles. There are so many different Seattles, geographically, culturally, but it takes some looking. It takes some it takes some proactive. You're not just going to stumble across them. More and more in Seattle now, I think Seattle's become really good at putting on a very sort of homogenous veneer. And I think if you were just arriving here, it would take some digging to find the other interesting Seattles underneath that.
Yeah.
I also, what you and I have been in this. Did you grow up here, or are you an arrival also?
Well, what's interesting is we kind of match up on when we arrived. I arrived in 93.
Okay, yeah.
So I've seen quite a lot.
I feel like this town, I feel like I disagree with Seattle about what makes Seattle cool. I think everything that I fell in love with about Seattle in the early 90s, not to be too like nostalgic about it and like the 90s were the best, but I feel like all the things that I love about Seattle, Seattle hates about itself and has been trying to shake off the whole time I've been here. And it's been trying to become a town that I like less than the one I moved to. And some of that's just, again, affordability, and some of it is, progress. But yeah, I remember my mom, who I adore, came to Seattle in the 90s and looked at Pike Pine just as an example of a neighborhood that I lived in and loved, and was like, this place is filthy, it's dangerous, there's graffiti everywhere, there's aren't businesses there, what's going on here, it's scary and dark and dingy. And I was like, yeah, isn't it fantastic? I love it. And she comes to Seattle now and looks at Pike Pine and the large scale corporate redevelopment of that neighborhood and the dumpsters in front of the Comet Tavern, which were always a sort of icon of are now gone. And sometimes I wonder, like, where do they put their garbage now if the dumpsters aren't right out in front anymore? Because they don't have an alley. I don't know the answer to that question. But the dumpsters are gone. And my mom now adores Pike Pine. And I look at it and I'm like, where did the neighborhood go?
Once your mom loves it, it's no longer cool.
Right. So yeah, I don't know. That's a wandering answer to your question, but this realization that Seattle and I disagree about what makes it cool has been eye-opening for me.
Well, we've got all sorts of things in the background going on. I want to honor the fact that you've got a board meeting to go to, but I want to try to bring in a few more questions and then maybe let you go and give you a breather. One question, I've got a bunch of questions, like what makes for a healthy and vibrant city? I think we've covered that in a bit already. Now this one, what is the role of an artist in society? Because an artist wants the space, he wants whatever he or she can get, but what does the artist owe the community?
I have no idea.
Well, I can tell you, for me, I wasn't getting anything from anybody, and I moved in 93 with just the shirt on my back, more or less, and I had to find a job within a month. And if I didn't get my ducks in a row, I just would have to move back to wherever I came from. But I kind of blew up everything where I didn't have a place to go back to, because I'd finished school in Houston, and I didn't have a place. I just was moving forward as a bullet, moving forward into Seattle. I got to make it, or I don't know, maybe a less adventurous locale. But the thing is, in '93, Seattle was still pretty slow. Even though we had grunge, it was still pretty slow.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to be said for the artist, just being very self-reliant. Maybe you won't get picked up by anybody. Maybe you won't get the art grants. Maybe your work is great, but it doesn't fit the certain trend, a certain whatever. And you gotta eat. So
right.
The thing you have to do is just keep making your art. And you do it long enough, you're an artist. You no longer have to feel self-conscious about saying you're an artist.
There's in the economic development world, they talk about the sort of industrial economy and then the tech economy, and that we're coming into this period of a creative economy. And the artist's role, I think, is to ask what isn't there, what doesn't exist, and to try and fill that void, right? It's a creative act. The definition is like, what can I do that has not been done before? I'm not going to paint the Mona Lisa again. I'm going to paint the Mona Lisa with a red shirt on this time. Or that what doesn't exist, what isn't there, is this sort of entrepreneurial, creative act, and that's the role, is to point to what isn't.
I want to give you the opportunity, and in closing, what if you could have a crystal ball and you're looking at it, what do you see as in the future for Seattle, and what do you see as the legacy for Cultural Space Agency?
A colleague of mine likes to say that lack of resources is not a problem that Seattle faces. He likes to point out that there are 3 different space exploration companies based in Seattle. If that doesn't reflect an abundance of resources in this town, then nothing does. That what this town needs is the audacity of vision to activate those resources, to mobilize those resources. And so in the crystal ball, I see a recognition by well-resourced communities, by stacks of capital, however you want to define them or represent them, that the value that gets generated in this town is by cultural communities. And if you want to maintain value, you've got to invest those resources back in cultural communities. And so I see a recognition of the value of those communities and of that work in a way that results in real investment in arts and culture in this town.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Matthew, for doing this. You didn't have to. You've been very generous. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. This has been great. Yeah, thank you again.